So first, thank you for having me today and joining me, and to the Congress, obviously, for this opportunity. I'm going to be talking to you about something that is very close to me personally. Just a little introduction for those of you who I haven't met personally yet. I've spent the last over 20 years working across technology and media companies, and my latest role was in Google, building their text-to-speech technology, which strangely happened during the start of COVID, or it started to get exacerbated. But some of the numbers that I'm going to be sharing with you today were nowhere near what we're seeing. They were all projected to grow, but not quite to this capacity, which is in a way good news considering yesterday's announcement from His Excellency about the partnership and what the region is trying to do in terms of Arabic language and propelling that forward. So that's good. So to start off, I want to tell you a little story about a fish, which might seem strange until maybe you hear the story. About 6 months or so ago, I took my two young little boys back to Armenia, where I'm from, where I was born. It was not their first time going there, but it was the first time where, because of their age, I decided to give them a cultural experience and tell them more about their heritage and teach them about where they come from. Halfway through the trip, we went to a restaurant where we had Armenian red trout by the riverside at a restaurant for dinner. And unbeknownst to them, the following day, they were going to be using the swim bladder from the very same fish to create something, which I will show you now. What happened was that after we had, and you can pass this around, this delicious food, the following day, we went to a sort of workshop. I had decided that in order to engage my young children and really get them ingrained into our culture, I didn't want to tell them things that they couldn't contextualize because they're only 6 and 7 years old at the time. So I thought, how do I create an experience that will stay with them forever and keep them interested in asking questions and building curiosities? Good throw. I was going to do that in the beginning, but then I thought nobody's going to catch my throw, so well done. I should have given it to you. After this dinner, we went to this old home of an architect. And when we walked in, you could tell that they had left the home exactly as it once was. There was lots of books, lots of art, sculptures. And in the center of the table where we were going to be sitting for the next 3 hours, there were baskets of these very same balls, except they were 300 years old. And so we sat down around the table, not knowing what this exercise was going to be or what the story was that was going to accompany it. And we started learning about the heritage and the history of these balls. And it turned out that the center of what you just passed around, and feel free to pass it to those who have just joined as well, is actually filled with that swim bladder, which is blown up into a balloon, inserted into the ball, wrapped around in wool, wrapped again around in plain yarn, and then woven into color based on everybody's individual preference. And what I thought was going to be an experience for my kids actually turned out to be something that I learned as well, because I was informed by the person who was telling us the story and teaching us how to weave, that these were actually used in the city where my grandfather was born. And even though he had told me many stories over the years about different things and about his past and my ancestors, etc., I had never heard about the story of these balls that were once upon a time footballs that children would kick around in the streets. That, by the way, even over 300 years had stayed in pristine condition, and the same way that they almost look identical to this one, which is only 6 months old. So in that experience, as I watched my two little boys, which if you have children, you know that boys at that age of 6 and 7 can't sit still. So the fact that they were sitting still for 3 hours and just weaving and interrupting and not completing the ball because they had so many questions for the person who was telling us the story made me think two things. Number one, how even with all the curiosity on my end and all the talking and stories coming from my grandparents, had I never heard about this story? Because had I heard about it, I would have certainly told my children much before they ever visited Armenia for the first time. And the second is, the story doesn't scale. So No pun intended with the fish, but when I talk about scales. But when I mean scale, we were sitting in someone's home and in their living room, and it was a very personalized experience. And there was no way to propel the story forward until all the, millions of other children, not only Armenian, but not Armenian, about where these balls stem from, and try to create not only an identity around it and tell a story about the resourcefulness that started such a long time ago, but also spread that creativity and that engagement and curiosity and align stories from other cultures that might be similar, of which I'm sure there are many. So that's what I was thinking about, and I started to think about what really makes stories matter. At the end of the day, when we each hear a story, whether that be on the news, whether that be in a book, whether that be from another person, what makes stories matter? So I'd love to ask you what you think as well. Anybody have any thoughts on why stories matter to us? Yes, please. I'll give you a microphone. Thank you.
In my experience, stories matter because it's a way for people to relate to something. So our memory works better with stories.
Yes.
And
yes.
If you want somebody to remember something, tell them a story, so they can draw the connections between the allegories in real life in order to remember the purpose of that story.
Relation to one another, understanding one another better, keeping that story in mind as a way to remember it long term. That's absolutely true. Any other people want to answer that question? By the way, sorry to interrupt, but if you want to hear me because it's a silent session, you'll need your headphones and it's 0. Okay, just in case. I know I'm already loud, so. Did you have one? Yes.
Yeah, it's you can learn and unlearn things.
Learn and unlearn things. Yes. Okay. So about the educational elements of storytelling, absolutely. And I think to me that is the first one that I think about as well, is education not only to one another in relation to how we engage with one another, how we understand each other better, but also how to educate, to fuel imagination, to fuel innovation, to think about what we do in the future. Of course, in my example, I thought a lot about preservation of culture and things that were really important to my heritage that even with all the curiosity, I had no way of learning about. Also thought about, kind of how do you keep a moment in time? Because when that person sitting at the table was telling me and my boys the story of the children playing football 300 years ago, I was thinking about my grandfather, who was nearly 90 or 100 when he passed away, and how he as a little child also likely played with something similar, if not the same. And as you mentioned, fostering kind of understanding and empathy and learning from one another to continue that relationship and to build on that further. I think unfortunately nowadays, and this is everywhere in the world, there's a lot of barriers that prevent us from not necessarily learning stories, but really engaging. And one of those barriers is the fact that the speed from 30 years ago is absolutely insane. And there's so much content, so much information out in the world that to stop and really digest and engage and better, spend time with something that is new information can be difficult. And it's not getting slower or easier to do that. So this is one of the challenges that I think everybody in the world is clearly facing right now, and trying to understand what matters, where do we start, what are those starting points as we engage with the new speed. The other thing is that there's this bizarre myth that stories have nothing to do with technology and innovation, which is ironic considering that when the printing press was first invented in the 15th century, that's the first time that technology and innovation and books came together. And since then, of course, a lot of the innovation and or technology has to drive some sort of content. So I would argue that actually in the reverse is true, and stories and those elements that we purvey through technology are more important now than they've ever been before. Because of the very reason that we talked about before in terms of the speed, and also because of this weird disconnect and misnomer that the two are not interrelated when they are phenomenally interrelated and very important. Regardless of what you do, by the way, you can think about healthcare, you can think about law, you can think about publishing in and of itself, you can think about any sector, and regardless of what it may be, there will need to be some sort of storytelling that is used through the technology to propel that forward. So we're back to fish again. Why, you ask? Not because I love fish, although I do, but that's not the reason. So our dear goldfish here is famously known to have 9 seconds of focused time. So I have another question for all of you in the audience. How much focus do you think humans have nowadays? 3 seconds. So you think the human attention span today is 3 seconds, okay? Any other guesses? Yes, it's getting shorter. By 25% over the last 25 years, it has decreased by 25%, which is an insane percentage. Any other guesses on what the new number might be? We have 3%. 3 minutes? 3 minutes. That's healthy, I would say. Generous of you for humankind. The new number is 8.25 seconds. That is the human attention span today in 2025, and again, a decrease by 25% from the year 2000, which is not getting easier to deal with, but I think the reason it's both a barrier and a potential opportunity is the fact that it's going to be about what type of content we discuss. Yes, please.
When they're saying the human attention span, what is that based on? Is that based on how long it takes a person to scroll away from a video?
Yes, it's about that fragmented focus. So how quickly will you get distracted by something?
But what about if we're talking about a film or a book or a conversation?
Even
There's
then,
different settings over here.
Yes, because this is the average number, but even then, to keep it deep focus is much harder, and that's the average that they've measured in the year 2025. Well, I don't think it's that. I think it's the way we consume. I think that's a very easy kind of scapegoat, for behavior. But it's the way we consume and the type of information that we are given to consume that we can't tear away from. But I think that there's going to be, I get asked a lot about what I think the future of AI will bring, et cetera. And I think that's a silly question, regardless of the time period that we're in. But the one thing that I do think will be true is that you will see a difference in quality versus not. And AI will show that to us very quickly in terms of content creation. And you're already seeing that now in terms of people being bored or saying that they're not really engaging. And because it is using AI, it is measured. You just have to keep an eye out for who's measuring it and how, and ask those very critical questions. But I think the quality element of content will play a massive role in how the future is determined, which might be a good thing long term, but painful short term. So I just want to go through a few other challenges that we have that are, things that people are working on and issues they're dealing with globally when it comes to this. Number one is that, if you think about discoverability and awareness and how people find content, that is because there is so much of it. That has become a very big fight. Again, regardless of sector, regardless of region. And so when it comes to things like audiobooks that we were chatting about yesterday, or the big announcement that went on about Audible, the fact that people don't even associate books and audio, or sometimes don't even know that they can have that content in that way, is another area of low discoverability or lack of awareness. This differs very much by market, and obviously with the curve of and the more content that is being created in the regions, that is changing, but it is still a massive issue. Oh, is this not working? Okay. Better? Okay. The other thing is that depending on where you are in the world, there are some payment infrastructure issues. How easily you can pay for content, how much it costs, and how much there is of it. Clearly that varies again by market. So this is global trends. Dialect diversity, which is definitely an issue for the Arab nations. It's an issue for Armenia, an issue for anything Spanish language or French language, because it will differ by region, how information is consumed and what dialect it is created with. There's also talent shortage for narration, and we'll talk about how that is getting resolved, because I think there's some phenomenal things that are being launched that are really helping this, but the utility of them and how, whether there's kind of fatigue long term, so whether people engage with that is kind of more of the challenge moving forward. There's also listener habits, so we touched on this with the goldfish. People being used to very short, quick form content and what that means for a longer audiobook and how that's created. And then locally written books. So there is a limited supply, depending again on region, of locally written books. And as you mentioned, a lot of that content that is relatable, that does emanate the right type of story from the right region in the voice of a person who's experienced that, is very important when it comes to both depth, when it comes to actually developing that narrative correctly. Oops. And the last was around rights and licensing confusion. So this is, again, global issue, but when we speak specifically about audio, it's an even bigger issue, because historically, when books were created, nobody was thinking we were going to be sitting around listening to audio content, 100 plus years later. And so the majority of the books, particularly the traditional content that we have, don't actually have the right rights. And either there is no copyright for that content, so it's kind of a first come, first serve, a free grab, which doesn't necessarily help the quality conversation. Or if there is a publisher that owns that content, they haven't necessarily thought about engaging on the audio side until that conversation and argument begins almost. And I saw this quite clearly at Google, because we were dealing with all the major publishers in the EMEA region. And for a lot of their books, even new trade content that was being published, that was fiction content, the editors and the publishers were just starting to ramp up in the year 2020 to think about how to include audio rights. And it started to segment into two different conversations, which can be frustrating for an author and a publisher long term, and certainly for a consumer who's trying to get that content. So thinking about all of this and that context, I wanted to talk about this number. Any guesses as to what 3% might allude to? You have a guess? No? Yes, you have a guess? Yes? Yes. Guess. Say that again?
What we retain, the information we retain.
What we retain, yes. Okay. Any other guesses? On the internet? Yes, that's correct. It's the percentage of all Arabic content currently on the internet. And this is the high end. The average is, they're saying, 1 to 3%. Now, considering there's 500 million Arabic speakers, native Arabic speakers in the world, that number is significantly low. And obviously, there's plenty of room for opportunity. So we're talking about all content. We're not just talking about news content or book content. We're talking about all content collectively, which shows you the opportunity that there is to create more. And then 3 more numbers for you. So the first one we'll start with is 50 million. And as a diasporan myself, I can relate mostly to this number, because clearly there's a lot of people that are not living in Arab nations today, and they're living all over the world, 50 million of them, and their language levels vary based on where they live, how long they've lived there. Clearly it's a challenge, as I mentioned earlier on, to pass that on to younger generations as well. So that's the 50 million number. The 450 is the total that we talked about. The World Bank estimate of total Arab speakers globally is 508 million. So going with that number, that leaves about 450 million. Again, there's still different dialects, still different countries and cultural nuances taken into account. But when I think about, the opportunity, I don't just think about these two numbers and only Arab speakers. I think about everybody who has access to a mobile phone, everybody who has access to get that content, because the beauty of technology is that, well, 6 months ago, and I say this quite literally, 6 months ago, it was not possible to translate Arabic content into every dialect, or let's say English content into every dialect of Arabic, or Armenian content into every dialect of Arabic. That today is possible, which in 6 months span of time, knowing from my Google days how long it takes to develop those things normally, tells you how quickly those technology companies are working to offer those, and they're all over the world, including in the MENA region. And there's so many opportunities for both translation and to think about the bigger audience that you have globally for your content outside of just the Arabic nations. So the three things that are on the rise, of course, we're going to talk about audiobooks a bit more deeply in a moment. Podcasts, there's 10 million people who are listening to podcasts about an hour a day, close to 67% of adults that listen to podcasts. So audio is a big element of getting information. And self-publishing is also another thing that has been on the rise. And I think that's about, the speed and the potentially the control of getting your story out there, and the ability to do it, and understand which vehicles and distribution channels that you use to get it to your readers. So looking at audiobooks more specifically, because this is one of the things that we chatted about, or that was announced yesterday by His Excellency, this is the global audiobook market, the projected numbers into 2032. And again, when I was working on text-to-speech in 2020, these numbers were significantly lower. So you can already see a massive change in how much they've grown. And when you look at MENA specifically, this is how MENA breaks down. So 56% of the audiobook market and usage today is accounted for in the Levant region, in North Africa, and in Egypt. And the rest is in Saudi and the Gulf regions. So again, for the latter, there's still a massive opportunity, but that's in terms of usage. That's not in terms of content available. So if you look at total content available, I think right now there's an estimate of about 7,000 books that have been converted into audio that aren't easily accessible to you yet. But considering yesterday's announcement, if they were to propel that to you through Audible or those channels, then it would open up the ability to create more and more content over time. One of the things that I always think about is, how do I, when there is so much change constantly, how do you get a pulse on what to start with first? And so I always go back to the customer. What does the customer need? So I asked any Arabic-speaking friends that I had if they could share this with their friends and family, and we got a total of 100 people surveyed to give us a good estimate into what people were thinking, what the interests were from individuals depending on what country they were in, what age group they were in, and what they wanted to see. So 60% of the people who filled out the survey ended up being female, 40% male, and 55% of them were under the age of 44. And I call that out specifically because obviously this is about how do we build content that's relevant for new generations to keep them engaged, and deliver content in formats that are useful and warranted and needed by them. So these are some of the questions that we asked. So if Arabic classics were adapted into modern formats, how likely would you be to engage? And the majority we're talking about the likelihood of engagement, and I'll break that down a little bit further in terms of what they wanted to see. And the number one thing that came back from the majority of people when you asked them what held you back from engaging with Arabic content was that they were not sure where to look, so discoverability. And I talked to several publishers as well throughout the region, and they said their biggest challenge is actually funding the marketing to get it in the hands of users who are searching for that content, and in the right way. So I'll touch on that a little bit more. When I asked what specific classics they would want to see in audio format, there were a lot of books that came up. These 4 came up the most often. And so you can see that they range from children's folk fables to the Holy Quran and everything in between. So there's quite a lot of options and interest areas that people want to see. But I think that this is the most interesting, because I think when you're trying to solve a problem or understand where to begin, you should first not shy away from looking at the frustrations of your consumer. So whether you're an author, whether you're a publisher, whether you're a content creator of another sort, I think understanding these frustrations, and there were many that came back, but these were the top line topics, is very important. So quality was a big element of that. Understanding the content was another element, and I think that deals with then dialect related challenges. The speed of speech, which clearly with technology you're able to change that to whatever you prefer and need. And then also the same struggle that I have with my own children, which is as you try and teach younger children your language, which is very traditional and very nuanced and very different from what they learn in English, let's say, or any European language, is that you want to draw them in and engage them so that they can really find content that is relatable to them, that will speak to them at their age group. You don't want to give them anything that is too old for them to consume, that they're not ready for, and you certainly don't want to bore them with anything that is too young. But the last thing that I think that you want to do if you're trying to educate your children is only plop them in front of content and hope that they learn, because usually that doesn't work, sadly. For those of us who are mothers, we've tried that, I'm sure. But so this is a struggle, and this came up time and time again. And as one example, I spoke to several publishers who had a lot of great children's content, and they talked about sales in the diaspora. So for example, if you're a publisher who has a lot of sales coming from the UK, what are some of the challenges that you see? And one of the issues that they had was the actual technical setup and infrastructure of the website that they sell through, and then the delivery of that content. So these are all things that if you're trying to build for an audience, you want to be asking, even if they're frustrating to hear, because then you start solving the right problems rather than solving everything, which can be a little bit overwhelming considering the speed that we're all flying at. So some of the instruments that I think are available, and like I said, over 6 months ago, these things didn't exist. When I think back to my own youth and how I got engaged with stories and I really started learning things. I grew up, or I was born in Soviet Armenia, and so at the time, my parents couldn't find any content on vinyl for us to listen to. So the Three Little Pigs, I distinctly remember that they were trying to find us content that was not in Russian language, for example, which we had to learn at school. But I can still tell you that the first time that I listened to that story on vinyl in English, I remember, I was likely 4 or 5 years old. I remember the moment that the wolf blew the house down and I ran out of the porch to my parents who were with my little sister. And I can still remember that moment now, 40 years later. And so these things don't just stick with you because, for no reason. They create they develop your imagination in a different way. And audio, similar to why people really engage with video content, is so powerful that I think you can't undermine the utility of it and how, especially at a young age, children engage. And speaking to some others in a different part of the world, I also learned about this company called Little Storyteller. So this was in the 1970s, where they had a weekly serialized version of a magazine. And they would send this magazine to people with a cassette tape that you would play. And over time, you had the collectible collection of all the stories. So children would leaf through this and also listen to the stories on cassette tape in the 1970s as well. And so there's many examples like this all over the world, the audiobooks of their time, shall we say. But clearly things have changed drastically. And I think when they're done correctly, they're done phenomenally well. So to give you 2 examples, one on the left is called Greeking Out. This is a podcast that the National Geographic has started. And so when my children were learning about Greek mythology at school, And we were told that this is a great way to get them to engage outside of school hours so that they could hear quality content that wasn't rubbish, but it was also truly telling the right story historically from a historical perspective. And when you listen to this content, they go down to all the nuance as if you were reading the book yourself, the original books yourself, but they've added music, they've added different voices, they've added almost a complete movie soundtrack to the audio. So they're not watching anything, it's purely listening experience, but it's so engaging and so enthralling that they will, again, similar to the ball, sit there for hours and really try to understand and ask questions. And you can measure that engagement based on how much more they want to do later and whether they ask for it, and also whether they are actually picking up the content and asking the right questions and learning what they're listening to. The second, this actually came out yesterday. So the Pottermore organization announced yesterday, they own all the Harry Potter books, that now, instead of having their individual books recorded by an individual reader, they are going to have different actors recording. So you will hear the sound of a train, you will hear the sound of rainfall, and clearly they've done that through movies. It's a massive franchise. But I think, quite frankly, the best stories are here, not sitting in England. So I think there's so much opportunity to take that same premise and really build powerful content that has never seen, the light in the way that it deserves to, in a modernized way that we can get all generations to engage with. And as you know from this franchise, likely, this is not for children anymore. You have grown adults on September 1st sitting in King's Cross waiting for the bell to ring for the whatever train Harry Potter is sitting on. And so it's an entire experience, which has made it all the way to Abu Dhabi from the posters that I see outside and the massive billboards. But I think that this is where you want to lead that content creation to, and keep the quality, which is such a fundamental difference between what will see longevity and what will not. Everything that is, trendy of the moment is going to live, I think, only in the moment. But everything that has lived for hundreds and thousands of years, or new stories that have that quality of depth that have never been told before, modern stories as well, to develop them in a way that they maintain and grow in that quality, I think is going to create the right type of longevity that they deserve. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk about is who has kind of been doing what from the technology side. So as I mentioned 6 months ago, when I first when I went back to Armenia and first started telling you the story about the fish, most of this did not exist, certainly not in Arabic. And I can tell you, working with the product teams, that there is a way to prioritize content, and partly it's appetite and engagement. So I think I have never seen the level of eagerness to develop, and certainly this region is at the forefront of engaging in technology, which I think bodes well. Now the content and the creation needs to match that, so the right types of stories are told. One thing that I recommend that you do, that I've tried myself, is actually testing out what 11 Labs has built. And clearly, I think Marwa earlier was speaking about what Google has done with Gemini in Arabic. So if you went to that session, you heard her speak as well. But 11 Labs is very interesting. So in duality with what others have been doing, you can go in and you can do a number of things. So as I mentioned, in the year 2020, I was starting to build the text-to-speech technology and bring that out to the masses through Google. At the time, even in English language, there were barely 4 voices, and they were somewhat weak, let's say. There was one voice that people famously liked to test with because it was the best in terms of quality. Now, you can take any content, including, I've tried this with Armenian, and turn it into that text into speech, which is incredible. The fact that it can read and understand, and every day there's improvements in terms of quality of the language, the level of dialect depth, which we have as Armenians as well, and also the ability to clone a voice. So, for example, if you're a celebrity and I'll get to you in a minute, if you're a celebrity or a narrator professionally, you can now clone that voice of yours and get compensated for when it is used, which did not exist. And it was certainly a conversation that was happening when we were building this technology at Google. Did you have a question or a comment?
It was just about that. I was wondering if you're cloning your voice, because I've played around with 11, and I was wondering,
Yes.
a lot of the voices are only under the paid model, right? Very few of them are under the free model.
Yes.
And I was wondering if these were actually real voiceover artists or narrators who got paid for their voice being cloned. So
Yes.
thank you for answering that question.
No problem. So there's this is something that I'd never also done before, thinking about how quickly technology moves. Up there it says talk to L. You see that? So if you click on that yourself without signing up or anything, you click on that and you verbally ask questions to their chatbot, it will speak to you as if it were a human on the other end, which just the chat function, how phenomenally that has grown and actually become useful versus annoying is incredible as well. I know we've all experienced that if you've ever tried chatting with something on a chatbot. But to answer your specific question, there's multiple ways that you can do it. You can either take somebody else's voice, and what they do is they ask a professional narrator or somebody who wants to become a narrator to record 30 minutes, and then they use that voice. That's the professional cloning element, which I think is what you're speaking about in terms of the payment. So if you want to have your voice in Arabic, in your dialect, let's say you are a professional narrator, you can now do that. So they give you 30 minutes of content that you record. They actually give you the types of microphones you need to have. But considering what on the other end is possible, I think it's very minimal cost. And then they take that voice, and they don't take exactly what you've read, but they've taken a snippet to introduce your voice, and you type that out to say that this is how I want to be introduced. This is what maybe I imagine my voice being used for. And then it becomes available in their catalog. Once they script it out and they clean it up, it becomes available in their catalog. So you are essentially using all the voices that have been recorded are modeled on human voices. So once upon a time, whether it's a new voice that's being added into the catalog or an existing one, somebody's voice was used to train that content. Yes. Oh, sorry, just going to bring... No, it's okay. Please.
So I have a question, especially with children and the mother is out at work and, the mother is not home.
Yes.
Have been there any attempts to clone the mother voice to read a story while the child is kind of flipping through? Is the AI there to do it? And just to mention about Harry Potter, what you said now they're having, actually this I've seen with our child 15 years ago, Leapfrog.
Yes.
Had books with that.
I worked with Leapfrog, yes.
And
yes.
He loved
yes.
it. It was amazing because it has the sounds and the cricket and and the child loved it, but he was learning to read. He would put the pen and he learned the word, but during that time there is all the effects of the sound effects. It was wonderful.
Yes, so just to comment on your comment about Leapfrog, so I actually worked with them about 15 years ago, and they're an educational toy building company, and they do a lot of research on how children engage, and they're very measured about how they build toys for children. So pre the mother reading to her child directly, that's definitely one of those, but it goes to a certain age, and then there's nothing. So my children, for example, now who are 6 and 8, they don't have Leapfrog toys anymore. There's nothing for their age group, and so I'm in this weird middle. And I actually heard a lot of that feedback from parents who filled out the survey saying, my child is not a baby and is not a teenager, so I can't give them access to this kind of content, and I'm struggling to find this middle ground of content that's right for them, especially when it's primed for the development and learning of the Arabic language, because you basically have to cement that in before the age of 10. And so if there is missing content, that is another massive opportunity. And so to your question about mothers specifically and cloning their voices, when you go into this catalog, and again, I highly recommend going in and just playing with it. You don't have to use it or sign up for anything, but you can see what's available. You'll see different descriptions, and some of them do say, I read children's stories, and then you can listen to the excerpt of the voice, and then you can take content that is available. In April, strangely enough, I was in the Bologna Book Fair, which is a children's book fair. And at the time, I was on a panel with one of the people from 11 Labs, and I said to him, when are you going to launch Armenian? Because I said, I'm going to ask you this publicly because I want an answer publicly when you're going to launch Armenian. And he said, no, it's coming in the next few months. When he said that, knowing, again, from a tech company, that is just, public speak necessarily, but a few months later, sure enough, there is no professional cloning yet that like there is for Arabic, but they do have text-to-speech in Armenian, which is already phenomenal. So for the first time, I believe all those responses, and I see the dialect difference. And I think there is still a way to go to perfect those nuances, but it's massive because, again, going back to the numbers that I shared with you, it's not just about teaching the children who are learning Arabic or having content translated for this audience. It's about the globe also receiving, when they have access, your stories from you. Because if I go into Waterstones today, a majority of the stories written about anybody from the MENA region are by British publishers. And so I think owning that content and telling it from that localized voice is so important. And these tools can help you do that in a much better way because that scale is now reachable. And so, yes, I know it's difficult because there's a lot changing all the time, so it's difficult to keep up with it. But I think it's also a tremendous opportunity and a great one. If you are, I don't know if anybody in here a publisher? Okay, yes. If you say so, then yes. That's a yes. Well, yes, too? Okay, excellent. So I worked with a lot of publishers. I had the pleasure of working with a lot of publishers, and coming from a world where I worked with a lot of retailers, one of the things that I was surprised by was how, two things actually I was surprised by. Number one, publishers didn't think of themselves as booksellers, which I found fascinating. So they did not think of themselves as retailers. And I had come from a decade and a half of working with retailers in the kind of traditional sense, let's say, clothing retailers or consumer electronics retailers who absolutely, regardless of what they sold, they were retailers in their heads. And so they behaved like retailers, which meant that their first port of call was to understand how to get what they were selling to their consumers. So this is my first kind of surprise when I was working with publishers. The second was that on the technology side, the people who are building the technologies across all companies, now again that is changing clearly because you're getting that individual ability as a consumer to engage. But then initially they would think of their consumer as the publisher, not the end consumer of the content, which I also found quite mind-boggling. So when I started to break that down with them, one of the things that I realized is that retailers think very much in these channels. They think, okay, what is it that I'm selling? What is the content and who is it for? Or the product or service? How do I get it in their hands as quickly as possible with as least number of steps? How do I make sure that all the distribution channels and third-party retailers that I work with are also aware of any stopgaps there? And then how do I use technology to scale and drive this most effectively? Now, the problem, regardless of the sector that you're in the world today, everybody's talking about AI, right? But the underlying infrastructure and architecture of a business, if it's not tied together as you scale, so for example, if there's no way to know how much content is available through your third-party retailers or what your customers are directly saying and providing to you as feedback, it's really difficult for you to be able to operate and be nimble and use AI to its fullest advantage. Now, for over a decade, we've all been using AI, but we didn't call it that clearly. Anytime you had a recommendation or anything was personalized to you, that was all AI. But now that we're talking about it more openly and understanding it a bit better, one of the elements that I caution is that very few people are actually talking about what maps underneath. And a lot of people are buying a lot of shiny tools, putting them on top, but they don't work. So they become shelfware. And the reason they won't work, and again, I'm speaking cross-sector, is because if all these elements, and there's many, many more, I'm just pointing out the four in the publishing sphere, if you don't tie those together, it's almost a moot exercise, because you won't be able to you're either going to infer the wrong results and the wrong information, or you're not going to be able to understand quickly enough what you need to do to react. And as your consumers become more like goldfish and less like humans, this becomes more problematic because you have to be able to quickly and nimbly react to their needs. So that's why I mentioned, for anybody who's dealing with publishing and any element of this, I think it's something really interesting to think about. One thing I'll call out on the marketing side, and this is kind of between what I would think of as technology and marketing as well, is this concept of the digital marketing practices. So have you heard of SEO, for example? So SEO is search engine optimization, and it's when you go and type some information into a website, how does it come up naturally without any payment on something like Google? So once upon a time, there were 2 or 3 search engines max, and the majority was focused on Google. But now with AI and ChatGPT and tens of others that are popping up daily, you have to think about also AEO. And it's also called several other names. And this is developing. There's no clear answer for this. So if anybody tries to tell you that there is, that's not true. Not yet anyway. And that's because if you were to ask a question to ChatGPT and you were to ask a question and I was to ask a question, we would likely get 3 different answers. So, but the mapping and the understanding of how you feed content onto your website or any channel where consumers come to you is going to be very important. So whoever understands that and is at the forefront will win much faster than somebody who isn't. And as the rules change constantly, I think it's important to keep tabs on these types of things. And again, if you ever feel, okay, there's a lot of things to kind of untangle, always go back to the consumer, because they will be the person who tells you the best what their needs are, and more importantly, what their frustrations are, so that you can either avoid them or fix them. And so thinking about, all these elements, I just wanted to stop and see if there were any questions on any of these specifically, because this is probably the more, beyond creating the content itself, I would say this is the most complicated part, especially as you start to scale a business of any sort. Any questions on any of these areas? Okay, so that leads us to, what we started talking about with, which is why are we, how do we take the content that either exists or is being developed and start to create these culturally rich experiences that are more in depth? One of the things that is really important to think about with narration is that approximately 60% of audiences drop a book, even if they've paid for it, if the narrator is not to their liking. And so when you think about how do you use technology to your advantage, before completely narrating a book, doing that A/B test in a very inexpensive way to say, okay, I have a piece of content that I want out in the world. How do I ensure that the narrator that I choose is the right one for the content that I have and for the audience who is going to be buying it? And I think the ability to test in the range of voices when you go into something like 11 Labs is phenomenal. So you will be able to match that. But don't match it from your own purview. Always ask the end consumer to ensure that they have that same purview that you do. And you have enough insight. So yeah, I think that I'll open it up for questions, but I think that the most important element is to think about, number one, how to get content that is going to be engaging for the new audiences that you're trying to build and bring along the journey. And I think it's really fascinating to see that there's such a focus on the youth in this Congress, because I think that's so vital to hit the nail on the head, but also talk about how to develop quality, long-lasting content, not just with what exists historically, but also any new content that is created. So whether that's serialized, whether that's multi-faceted in terms of actors, whether that's created with music or other theatrics that build more engaging relationships with a consumer and more loyalty, is almost moot, because I think it will become par for the course. It's just about who will do it first. So the fact that you have the appetite on the technology side is already a massive win. And now it's more about how do you create that content to not only engage Arabic speakers, both locally and diasporans, but also the rest of the world, and bring them into those stories that need to be told by you and by the writers that are actually experiencing them, whether they're reinventions of the old or the new. So with that, any questions? Thank you. Any questions I can answer? Yes. We have, do you have the, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so informative, and we learned a lot from you.
Pleasure.
We really appreciate it. Thank you. So my question to you, do you think eventually with all this AI, people now are publishing their own books, right, on, digitally.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think eventually they'll be able to publish their own audiobooks?
Audiobooks?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. And how do you think this is going to fit into all these big companies or,
Well, I think the big companies are betting on that based on the numbers that you saw and how quickly they're reacting, which, like I said, in 2020, when we were building it, even in Google, that speed, we had I think maybe initially 2 languages. First we had English, and then we started to develop Spanish, and then we added 2 more, but it took quite a long period of time. And this was just with an engineering team that was only focused on developing that. And now you see a promise that is made to me in April, and by the time that I come here in September, it's already live. That reaction is phenomenal. I would also say that the fact that there is more importance put on the dialects, rather than let's just have Arabic as a language, tick the box, but it doesn't take into account the cultural nuances, which is very important, especially as a consumer. And it's not, because it tells a story in a different way, completely different way. And we have 2 dialects in Armenian, Eastern and Western, and I can already tell you it's complicated because we don't understand each other. So I completely know, the challenge there, because there's much more in Arabic. And I think the fact that they're paying attention to things like that is vital. So I would imagine that there would be more services coming out, but 100%, I think this is the next. If you are an author, not thinking about audio is negligent in a way, but also owning that story and deciding how it's told, through what type of narration, and being able to measure it before you spend, because normally, at least in the UK, it costs anywhere from £2,000 to £10,000 to get one book narrated in audio by a human narrator. And this is, peanuts by comparison. I don't think, though, that will negate the role altogether, because I still think quality matters. And I can tell you from experience, I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I have sometimes, my son's, the head of the school recommended a book for parenting. I started listening to it, and I had to check whether it was a robot or not. And it was a human voice, but it was so awful that I went to the store and bought the book and started reading it instead, because I couldn't listen. And if you had given me the ability to decide, which I think which is where this is going, that's a game changer, both as publishers, as authors, and as the consumer. So I think that choice will become more. It'll be more interesting, and you will surely have new players. I think that deciding how you work, definitely understanding the rights that you have as the owner of content is vital, because unfortunately, regulation is a global problem that every country is solving differently, and that is a massive issue. But I also think that when you build in the right way, then it almost, as long as you understand the parameters and you hold those guardrails, that's what's most important. Because I think if we do this right, quality will win, and then the scale will help everybody who hasn't had the ability to share their stories in the right way. Yes. Yes.
But my question is, in Arabic, there is now companies that do, audiobooks.
Yes.
Again, I think there need to be some are excellent.
Yes.
Actually, narrators, some lack
Yes, so with regard to the ones that already have content in Arabic, what I was mentioning earlier, and this comes back to that data infrastructure. So one of them is, I think the 7,000 titles are with Storytel, for example, in Arabic. And I think that with this new partnership, ideally those dots are connected from the technology angle, and then that can go out to everyone. I think the challenge from, again, when I speak to publishers is more about how do I inform you of new content that's coming out, because the marketing is difficult and it's massive. But I think that the testing and not being afraid to test and fail, if you will, to understand what the consumer wants is exactly what will help you get the right content in the right hands at speed. So thank you for your question. Any other questions? Did you have one? Okay, well, thank you very much. Please feel free to shukran. That's the best I have in Arabic, besides mashallah. But thank you very much for your time and for coming, and feel free to stay in touch as well. If you have any more questions, I'm always available. Thank you.